The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole station was screaming. I was halfway through a bowl of reconstituted soup when the lights turned red and every alien on the deck froze. Not ducked, not ran, froze, the way a rabbit freezes when a shadow crosses the grass. I was the only one who kept eating. My name is Mara Voss, and 3 years ago I did not know that other worlds existed. Now I stood on a station built by a species who had not fought a war in 400 years, watching them stare at a warning light like it might reach out and touch them. A voice came over the speakers, calm and slow, in the layered tones the Concorde used for their announcements. Unknown vessels approaching outer boundary. All personnel proceed to shelter stations. Do not engage. Do not engage. That was always the instruction. I had heard it so many times I could recite it in 3 alien languages before I ever learned to order food in them. Commander Solon Ayeth appeared at the end of the corridor, moving faster than I had ever seen him move, which still was not very fast. He was tall, pale blue, with eyes that took up nearly half his face, built for a species that valued caution the way humans valued oxygen. "Corporal Voss," he said, breathless, "you have not moved." "I have finished my soup," I told him. "Should I not finish my soup?" He looked at me the way he always did when I said something that made no sense to him. "There are hostile ships entering the system." "I know," I said. "I heard the announcement. Twice, actually, because it repeats." He blinked, both sets of eyelids, which for his species meant real confusion. "You are not afraid." I stood up, dropped my bowl in the recycler, and checked the strap on my sidearm out of habit. Should I be? That question hung in the air between us longer than it should have. Solon did not answer it, because I do not think he had an answer. In his 400 years of peace, no one had ever asked him that question and meant it. I had been assigned to the Concorde 8 months earlier, one of 11 humans chosen to serve as liaisons after Earth was granted provisional status among the stars. Provisional. That word came up in every meeting, every briefing, every polite alien smile. It meant they were still deciding what to do with us. It meant they were still afraid of us, even though they had only ever seen us be kind. The Concorde itself was old, older than most of our recorded history combined. Hundreds of worlds bound together by treaties, trade, and a deep collective agreement that violence solved nothing, beautiful in theory, slow in practice, especially when something like the Skarn Dominion showed up at your border. I had read the files on the Skarn during my training. A breakaway faction, once part of the Concorde centuries ago, who decided that peace was a weakness to be harvested rather than a virtue to be kept. They took what they wanted from smaller worlds and called it correction. Most Concorde species feared even the sound of their name. I did not fear the sound of a name. I had grown up in a world where names on the news changed every week, and none of them ever stopped being frightening if you let them. Solon led me down the corridor toward the command deck, past dozens of crew members huddled in shelter alcoves, their long fingers laced together, murmuring what I assumed were prayers or calming mantras. I nodded to a few of them as I passed. They nodded back, wide-eyed, like I was already something strange. The command deck was chaos dressed up as order. Screens showed a cluster of unknown ships crossing into Concorde space, moving with a precision that told me this was not a scouting mission. This was a message. Ambassador Kalis Thorne stood at the center of it all, the highest-ranking human on the station, and the closest thing I had to a mentor since arriving. She was in her 50s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and had spent the last 2 years learning to translate human instinct into something the Concorde could tolerate hearing. "Report," she said the moment I stepped through the door, without turning around. "3 ships," said a technician near the main display, his voice trembling slightly. "Skarn configuration. They are not responding to hails." Kalis turned to Solon. "Casualty projections if they breach the outer colony?" Solon's mouth opened and closed twice before he answered. "Severe. The colony has no defense fleet. It has never needed one." I watched the room around me shift into something close to panic, careful and quiet panic, the kind that moves through a crowd like cold water. No one raised their voice. No one reached for a weapon. They simply began preparing to lose. I stepped forward. "Ambassador, permission to speak." Kalis glanced at me, and something in her expression told me she already knew what I was going to say and had already decided she agreed with it. "Go ahead, Corporal." "Send us," I said. "Send the human response team. We are closest, we are equipped, and we are not going to stand here and watch a colony fall because everyone is waiting for a committee to approve fear." The room went silent in a different way now. Not panic, disbelief. Solon turned to me slowly. "You want to fly toward the danger?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" he asked, and I do not think he meant it as a challenge. I think he genuinely wanted to understand. I thought about how to answer that in a way that would make sense to a species who had spent 4 centuries avoiding conflict entirely. The truth was simpler than anything I could translate, because someone has to, and we are already awake. Kalis allowed herself the smallest smile. She had heard me say things like this before, in smaller moments, and every time the Concord around us reacted the same way, somewhere between admiration and alarm. "The High Council will not authorize deployment without a formal vote," said another officer, a thin-furred being named Vex Orin who handled logistics for the station. "Voting takes time, possibly days." "The colony does not have days," I said. "Then we wait for the council," Vex insisted, though his voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the fear underneath the rule following. I looked at Kalis. She looked at Solon, and in that quiet, careful pause, I understood something about the Concord that no briefing document had ever told me plainly. They were not cowards. They were simply built for a universe that no longer existed, one where every threat could be negotiated with patience and time. The Skarn did not believe in patience. Neither, frankly, did I. "Ambassador," I said again, quieter this time, "give me my team. I will not wait for a vote while people are dying." Kalis exhaled slowly, the way she always did before making a decision that would get her in trouble later. Then she turned to the technician at the main console. "Patch me through to the shuttle bay. Corporal Voss's team is authorized for immediate deployment. Ambassadorial discretion, full responsibility on my record." Solon stared at her, then at me, something between horror and awe crossing his enormous eyes. "You would risk your position for this." "I would risk far more than my position," Kalis said simply. I did not wait to hear the rest of the conversation. I was already moving toward the shuttle bay, calling the rest of my team over comm as I ran. Lucas Grant, Nora Bennett, Daniel Cole, 3 names that meant nothing to the wider galaxy yet, 3 people who had grown up on a world that never once let them forget how fragile life could be, and had taught them anyway to run toward it rather than away. By the time I reached the bay, Lucas was already suited, checking a rifle with the calm efficiency of a man checking his morning coffee. Nora was loading gear onto the shuttle without being asked. Daniel stood at the ramp, arms crossed, grinning like this was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in months. "Guess the aliens finally need us for something other than translation duty," he said. "Guess so," I answered. Behind us, station crew watched from a safe distance, the same wide, uncertain eyes I had seen since the day I arrived. I understood, in that moment, that they were not just watching a shuttle prepare for launch. They were watching something they had never truly seen before, not in 400 years of peace, not in all their careful history. They were watching a species that did not wait to be told it was safe to be brave. The shuttle door sealed behind us with a heavy hiss. Through the small viewport, I caught one last glimpse of Solon standing frozen at the edge of the bay, both sets of eyelids wide open, watching us go. Lucas dropped into the pilot's seat and started the engines. "You good, Mara?" I looked out at the darkness ahead, where somewhere among the stars, 3 Skarn ships were carrying a threat toward people who had never learned to defend themselves, because they had never needed to. "I have never been better," I said, and meant every word of it. The engines roared to life beneath us, and for the first time since I had joined the Concord, I felt like I finally understood why they had been so afraid of us all along. It was not because we were dangerous. It was because we were the only ones in that entire station who were not afraid of danger at all. The shuttle shook as we broke away from the station, and Daniel gripped the overhead rail without complaint, the way you hold on when you already know the ride is going to get worse before it gets better. Nora sat across from me, running a systems check on the shuttle's small defense array, her fingers moving fast and sure. "You ever wonder why they still watch us like we might explode?" she asked, not looking up. "I have an idea," I said. "Kepler," Lucas guessed from the pilot seat. "Kepler," I confirmed. It had happened 2 years before I ever set foot on a Concorde station, back when Earth was still an unknown signal at the edge of their sensors rather than a member world. A small human research vessel, unarmed, barely more than a science lab with engines, had been mapping a distant system when a Skarn raiding party found it. 6 ships against 1. No weapons to speak of. Every calculation the Skarn made said the humans aboard would either surrender or be lost within minutes. The crew did neither. They stripped mining lasers meant for asteroid samples and rewired them into makeshift defense turrets. They used the ship's own hull plating as improvised shielding, welding it into place while under fire. When their engines failed, they vented atmosphere through the cargo bay to create a burst of thrust that no one on either side thought was possible, and used it to disable a Skarn vessel's weapons array. They did all of this while 3 crew members were injured. Air was running thin, and half the ship's systems were failing around them. By the time Concorde rescue ships arrived, only 1 Skarn vessel remained functional, and it was retreating. That, more than any speech or treaty, was the moment the Concorde realized humanity existed, and it was also the moment they became cautious of us. Not because we had won, but because of how ordinary it seemed to us to fight for our lives with whatever was on hand. Their species had weapons built over centuries, ships designed by committees who studied every possible threat for decades before approving a single hull plate. We had built ours out of rock-cutting tools in under an hour. "They call us fragile in the old records," Nora said, closing her display, right up until the moment they stopped calling us anything at all. I looked out the viewport at the streaking stars, thinking about Solin's face when I told him we would go. Somewhere out there, on the other side of this conflict that had not officially started yet, someone very different from us was doing the exact same thing we were, studying, calculating, trying to understand an unfamiliar people through numbers instead of instinct. His name, according to the intelligence briefings I had read months earlier, was Threx. Threx was not a soldier by nature. He had been an engineer once, before the Skarn Dominion split from the Concorde and rebuilt its entire culture around strength as the only true currency. He had risen through their ranks not because he loved conflict, but because he understood systems, and to him, every conflict was simply the largest system there was. He had studied the Kepler incident more thoroughly than almost anyone in the Dominion, running simulation after simulation, trying to understand how an unarmed science vessel had disabled 2 of his people's warships. His conclusion, recorded in a report that Concorde Intelligence had somehow acquired and passed along to our liaison office, was short and strange enough that I had read it 3 times just to make sure I understood it correctly. He wrote that humans did not calculate the odds of survival before acting, and that this was either the greatest weakness or the greatest strength he had ever observed in a species, and that until the Dominion determined which one it was, humanity should be treated as an unknown variable rather than a settled one. I respected him for that, in a strange way. He was the only one on either side who seemed to be asking the right question. Coming up on the colony boundary, Lucas said, cutting through my thoughts. The shuttle's main display flickered to life, showing the edge of Colony Verith, a modest agricultural settlement home to nearly 12,000 Concorde citizens, mostly farmers and researchers who had never once needed a defense fleet because nothing had ever threatened them before. Now 3 Skarn vessels hung in orbit above it like storm clouds waiting to break. Daniel leaned forward, studying the tactical display. "They are not attacking yet. They are probably cutting off communications first," Nora said, "isolating the colony from the rest of the Concorde before they move in on the ground." I checked the small equipment we had brought, standard-issue rifles, a handful of portable shield generators, and improvised tools Lucas had built from mining equipment we had gathered from a decommissioned cargo hauler weeks earlier, half as a joke at the time. It did not feel like a joke anymore. "We are not going to win this with equipment alone," I said. "We do not have enough of it, and we never will against 3 warships." "Then what is the plan?" Daniel asked, though from the look on his face I could tell he already suspected the answer. "We do what we always do," I said. "We use everything else." The Concorde operated with rules, formations, careful calculated formulas, passed down through centuries of controlled conflict resolution. It made them predictable, because their species had never needed to be anything else. We did not have 400 years of peace to unlearn. We had thousands of years of struggle to draw from, instead. Methods born not in classrooms but in forests, deserts, oceans, places where survival meant improvising with whatever the world gave you, and refusing to stop simply because the odds said you should. Nora pulled up a terrain map of Verath from the shuttle's databank, marking colony structures, open farmland, and a dense stretch of tall growing crop fields that stretched for kilometers along the colony's southern edge. "If we can draw ground forces into the crop fields," she said, tracing a line with her finger, "we lose visibility, but so do they. Their sensors are built for open ground, clean lines, predictable movement. We can use the cover to break their formations apart." Lucas nodded slowly. "It is not much of a plan." "It does not need to be much," I said. "It needs to work." Below us, the first signs of movement appeared on the display. Small shuttlecraft descending from the Skarn ships toward the colony's outer farms. Ground forces, deploying exactly the way Nora predicted, moving in tight formation across open terrain, because that was how their doctrine trained them to move. Methodical, confident, unbothered by an unfamiliar people they assumed could offer no real resistance. "They think this will be easy," Daniel muttered. "It usually is for them," I said, "right up until it is not." Lucas guided the shuttle down through a break in the atmosphere, keeping low, using the terrain to mask our approach the way we had trained 100 times in simulations that never quite captured what it felt like to do this for real. Below us, the crop fields stretched out gold and green, deceptively peaceful, farmers already moving toward shelter tunnels dug generations ago and never once used. We touched down at the edge of the fields, engines cutting to a low hum. Through the viewport, I could see the first Skarn troops advancing across the open farmland roughly a kilometer out, moving in perfect lines, their armor catching the light. Nora checked her rifle one last time. "You know they are going to underestimate us the same way they underestimated that research ship." "I know," I said, stepping toward the ramp. "Good," Daniel said, grinning despite himself. "I would hate for this to be an easy day." The ramp lowered with a hiss. Warm colony air rushing in, carrying the smell of crops and distant smoke where the first buildings had already caught fire. Somewhere above us, 3 warships continued their slow, confident approach, utterly certain that nothing waiting below could possibly change the outcome they had already calculated. They had run their numbers. They had studied their history. They believed they understood exactly what a soft, unarmed colony would look like. They had no idea that 4 humans had just landed in the crop fields, and that we did not act the way their numbers predicted at all. I stepped down onto the soil of a world I had never visited before, surrounded by people I had never met, about to face a battle that was not officially mine to face. And for the first time since arriving among the stars, I felt completely, calmly certain of exactly who I was. "Move to the tree line," I called to my team. "Let them come to us." And somewhere out there, watching through long-range sensors from the comfort of his flagship, Threx was about to learn something about humanity that no simulation could have ever prepared him for. The crop field swallowed us the moment we stepped into it, tall stalks rising well above my head, gold light filtering down in thin streaks that made the whole world feel underwater. Somewhere ahead, the Skarn ground unit continued its steady march, boots crushing dirt in a rhythm so even it sounded almost mechanical. "Spread out," I whispered into the comm. "Nora, left flank. Lucas, hold the rear approach. Daniel, with me." "Copy," came 3 quiet replies, none of them shaking, none of them hesitating. We moved low through the rows, the stalks brushing against our shoulders, the air thick with the smell of crushed grain and distant smoke. Ahead, through gaps in the field, I caught glimpses of the Skarn troops, tall armored figures with wide shoulders and thick-plated limbs, built for strength rather than speed, moving with a discipline that suggested none of them had ever once considered the possibility of losing. Their scanners swept the field in slow, careful arcs, calibrated for open terrain, for clean lines of sight, for an enemy who would stand and fight in formation the way every other species in this part of the galaxy had learned to do over centuries of careful, rule-bound conflict. They were not built to search for four people who had grown up hiding, sneaking, adapting, since long before any of us could walk. The first Skarn soldier passed within 3 meters of me and never once looked down. I let him go. We were not here to win a fight of numbers. We were here to break their formation apart, piece by piece, until the number stopped mattering. Daniel tapped my shoulder and pointed. A supply unit had separated from the main group, moving toward a small storage structure at the edge of the field, likely searching for colonists in hiding. 4 Skarn troops, no more. I nodded, and we moved. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, though it felt both faster and slower than that in the moment, the way real tension always does. We used the tall stalks as cover, moving in short bursts, staying low, letting the wind moving through the crops mask the sound of our footsteps. Daniel drew the attention of 2 soldiers with a thrown rock against a metal panel, and by the time they turned toward the sound, Nora and I had already closed the distance behind them. We did not need to overpower them through strength. We used their own momentum against them, disabling their equipment, disrupting their formation, forcing confusion into a unit that had never once needed to think for itself, because every action had always been dictated from above. Within minutes, the supply unit was neutralized, their communications cut, their equipment disabled, without a single shot needing to be fired from either side. Above us, in orbit, sensors aboard the Skarn flagship registered the sudden silence from the ground unit's 3rd patrol group, and Threx, standing at the center of his command deck, felt the first genuine flicker of concern he had experienced in this entire campaign. "Report," he said, his voice low and even. "Patrol Group 3 has gone silent," an officer answered. "No distress signal, no combat readings. They simply stopped transmitting. Perhaps a terrain interference," another officer offered. Threx did not answer immediately. He had read the Kepler report enough times to recognize the shape of what silence like that usually meant. "Increase drone coverage over the crop fields," he ordered, "and redirect the 2nd patrol group toward their position." Below, in the fields, I heard the shift in the wind before I saw it, the distant hum of a reconnaissance drone sweeping low over the crops, scanning in patterns too precise to be anything but a direct response to what we had just done. "They know something happened," Nora said quietly. "Good," I answered. "Let them wonder." We moved deeper into the field, drawing the 2nd patrol group further from the main colony structures, exactly the way Nora had planned. Lucas met us at a predetermined point near a dry irrigation channel, using the low ditch as cover, while he rigged one of his improvised charges to the underside of a support beam holding up an old harvesting structure. "If they funnel through here," he said, checking the wiring one last time, "we collapse the structure right on top of them. No casualties, just enough chaos to scatter the formation completely." "You are sure it will only cause chaos?" Daniel asked, watching him work. "I am sure it will not be pretty," Lucas admitted, "but no one gets seriously hurt. The beams are light enough." We took position along the ditch, waiting as the sound of the approaching Skarn patrol grew steadily louder. Boots against dirt, armor creaking, the low mechanical whir of scanning equipment sweeping back and forth across the field ahead of them. I counted 6 soldiers this time, larger group, more cautious formation, clearly already adjusting to the possibility that something had gone wrong with the previous unit. They passed directly beneath the old harvesting structure, exactly as planned. Lucas triggered the charge. The structure came down with a heavy groan of metal and old wood, not violent, not destructive in the way their own weapons would have been, but overwhelming, disorienting, burying half the patrol beneath collapsed framework and scattering the rest into a blind panic they had never once trained for. Their formation, so carefully built around calm, methodical advance, fell apart in seconds. We moved through the confusion fast, disabling equipment, cutting off communications, using the chaos itself as cover, the way we had learned to use every disadvantage as an advantage back home, long before any of us had ever left the ground we were born on. By the time the 3rd Skarn Patrol arrived to reinforce the position, they found no enemy waiting for them, only their own comrades disarmed, disoriented, and utterly unable to explain what exactly had happened to them. Aboard the flagship, Threx watched the drone footage in silence, replaying it twice, then a 3rd time, studying not the destruction, which was minimal, but the method. 4 unarmed engagements. No serious harm inflicted upon a single Skarn soldier, and yet an entire patrol group rendered useless within minutes. "They are not trying to defeat us," he said slowly, almost to himself. His second-in-command, a broad-shouldered officer named Grail, frowned at the display. "Then what are they trying to do?" "They are trying to make us doubt ourselves," Threx said, "and I believe it is working." Grail did not understand, and Threx did not attempt to explain it further, because he was not entirely certain he understood it himself. In 400 years, the Concord had built an entire civilization around avoiding conflict, and the Dominion had built its own culture around winning conflict through overwhelming strength and careful calculation. Neither approach had a category for an enemy who fought not to conquer and not to destroy, but simply to outlast, to adapt faster than the numbers could account for. Back in the fields, our small victories were not going unnoticed by the colonists we had come to protect. From the shelter tunnels beneath Varath, several colony defenders, farmers who had taken up whatever tools they had on hand out of desperation, began watching our movements through hidden vantage points, learning, adjusting, growing bolder with each passing minute. A young colonist named Fen Arolis, barely more than a teenager by his species standards, found me crouched behind a storage silo as I repositioned toward the colony's eastern perimeter. "You are one of the humans," he said, his voice trembling slightly, though not entirely from fear. "I am," I said. "They said your species does not know how to be afraid," he continued. I allowed myself a small, tired smile. "Everyone knows how to be afraid," I told him. "We simply decided a long time ago not to let it decide things for us." He considered that for a long moment, then held up a length of pipe he had clearly taken from a maintenance shed, gripping it with hands that were shaking but determined. "Then teach me." I looked at him, then at the pipe, then back at him, and something in his eyes reminded me of every person back home who had ever stood up to something far larger than themselves, simply because standing up was the only option that felt honest. "Stay behind me," I said. "Watch. Learn the timing. You do not need strength to disrupt a formation. You need patience and the willingness to move when it counts." By the time the sun above Varath began to dip toward the horizon, 3 separate Skarn ground units had been effectively neutralized without a single serious injury on either side, their formations scattered, their confidence visibly shaken. Colony defenders, emboldened by what they had witnessed, began organizing their own small resistance efforts, using terrain and improvised tools the same way we had shown them, adapting faster than anyone aboard the Skarn flagship could have anticipated. Threx stood alone on the observation deck as the reports continued to arrive, each one stranger than the last. Ground forces delayed, colonists resisting in ways his intelligence had never flagged as possible. An entire campaign, built around the assumption of an easy, uncontested advance, unraveling not through superior weapons, but through an approach to conflict his people had simply never encountered before. He opened a private channel to Dominion High Command, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty settling in his chest. "This is Commander Threx," he said. "Recommend immediate reassessment of Earth intelligence files. The humans present in this engagement are not behaving according to any known combat doctrine. They do not calculate risk the way we understand risk. They adapt faster than our sensors can track, and they appear entirely unconcerned with the odds against them. There was a long pause on the other end before High Command responded, their voice flat, almost dismissive. "Continue the advance, Commander. 4 individuals cannot alter the outcome of a full invasion force." Threx closed the channel without responding, watching the drone footage loop once more, 4 figures moving through a golden field like they had been born specifically for this moment, disrupting an entire military doctrine built over centuries without ever once needing to raise their voices. He had studied the Kepler incident for 2 years, searching for an explanation that made sense within the framework of everything his people understood about strength and strategy. Watching the footage now, he finally understood what that report had failed to fully capture. It was not that humans miscalculated the odds of survival. It was that they had simply decided, somewhere in their long and difficult history, that the odds were never the point at all. "Reassess everything," he said quietly to no one in particular. The words "for now" meant only for himself, though soon enough they would become the exact warning he would carry back to every corner of the Dominion that still believed Earth was a soft, unarmed world waiting quietly to be found. By the time the Skarn withdrew their remaining ships from orbit above Verath, 3 days had passed, and word of what happened there had already spread far beyond the colony itself, traveling faster than any official report could keep up with. I sat in a small medical bay aboard the Concorde relief ship that arrived to assist with recovery, watching Nora get a minor wound cleaned and sealed by an automated medical unit, while Lucas argued cheerfully with a technician about whether his improvised charges should be classified as weapons or simply as farming equipment used creatively. Daniel was outside, surrounded by a small crowd of colony children who kept asking him to repeat the story of the collapsing harvesting structure, each retelling growing slightly more dramatic than the last. Solon found me there, standing quietly in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "The Council wishes to speak with you," he said finally. "All of you." "I figured they might," I said, standing up. He hesitated before I could walk past him. "Corporal Voss," he said, and something in his voice had changed since the last time we spoke on the station. "What you did here, it does not fit into anything we understand about how conflict should be resolved." "I know," I said. "It should not have worked," he continued, almost to himself. "Every calculation says an unarmed defense force against a trained invasion unit should have resulted in significant loss." I turned to face him fully. "Solon, back on Earth, we do not always fight because the numbers favor us. Sometimes we fight because walking away is worse than losing." He considered that for a long time, his enormous eyes unusually still. "I do not think my people have ever truly understood that distinction," he admitted quietly. "Maybe that is exactly why you needed us here," I said. The council chamber, when we arrived, was unlike anything I had seen since joining the Concorde. A wide circular room filled with representatives from a dozen member worlds, all of them present in person rather than through the usual remote holographic feeds, which told me immediately how seriously they were taking what had happened at Verath. Ambassador Kalis stood near the center, addressing the gathered council with the calm, careful authority she had spent years building among people who did not naturally trust strength the way we did. "The action taken by Corporal Voss and her team violated no existing Concorde protocol," she said, though I understood immediately she was choosing her words with great care. "It was authorized under ambassadorial discretion, in response to an active and unmitigated threat to Concorde citizens." An elderly representative from a species I did not recognize, covered in fine silver scales, rose slowly from his seat. "The concern is not one of protocol, Ambassador. The concern is one of precedent. If 4 individuals, acting largely without formal military coordination, are capable of disrupting a full invasion unit, what does that suggest about the broader capabilities of Earth as a whole?" I felt the weight of that question settle over the room, and I understood, watching the careful, guarded expressions around me, that this was the real reason so many representatives had come in person, not out of gratitude, out of a need to look directly at the species they were suddenly reconsidering everything about. "It suggests," Kalis said evenly, that Earth is exactly what our own reports always said it was. A resilient world, shaped by hardship the Concord has not experienced in centuries. It does not suggest a threat, it suggests an opportunity, if the Council is willing to see it that way. The room fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. I stepped forward before I fully decided to, drawing every eye in the chamber toward me. "May I speak?" I asked. Kalis gave the smallest nod, and the Council, somewhat reluctantly, allowed it. "I am not going to pretend my presence here does not make some of you uneasy," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the size of the room. "I understand why. Your civilization built something remarkable out of centuries without conflict, and that is worth protecting. But the colonists at Verath did not survive because we were dangerous. They survived because when the moment came, we refused to simply accept that losing was the only option. That is not a threat to what you have built here. It is something you can learn from, the same way we have learned so much from all of you since arriving." A representative near the back, a broad-furred being from a world I had never visited, spoke up hesitantly. "The colonists of Verath have already requested that human liaisons remain stationed permanently in their system." Another representative added quietly, "Colony Thren has made a similar request, following reports of the engagement." Kalis glanced at me, something like quiet pride crossing her expression, though she said nothing. By the end of that council session, no formal decision had been reached, not officially, but something had shifted in the room that I do not think any of us could have fully articulated in that moment. We were no longer simply provisional guests, waiting for permission to belong. We had become something the Concord had never needed a category for before, and across a dozen worlds, word began to spread of what people started calling us, quietly at first, then with growing frequency. Deathworlders. It was not meant as an insult, not anymore. It became something closer to a quiet form of respect, mixed with a very real, very human sense of unease on their part, the kind you feel towards something you cannot fully predict. That evening, I found Feneralis sitting alone near the edge of the colony's shelter tunnels, staring out at the fields where everything had happened only days before. I sat beside him without speaking for a while, letting the quiet stretch between us the way it needed to. "I keep seeing it happen again," he admitted eventually, "even though it is over." "That happens," I told him gently. "It happened to me too, the first time I saw something I could not undo." "Does it stop?" he asked. "It gets easier to carry," I said. "It does not disappear completely, but you are not carrying it because you are weak. You are carrying it because you are still someone capable of feeling something after all of it. That matters more than most people realize." He was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Thank you, for staying, for teaching me." "I did not do much," I said. "You stayed," he said simply. "That was enough." We sat together until the colony's twin moons rose fully over the fields, and for the first time since arriving among the stars, I understood something about the reputation we were building that no council session could fully capture. We were not simply feared for our resilience. We were beginning to be trusted for our compassion alongside it, and that distinction, I suspected, would matter more in the coming days than anything else. Far beyond Verath, aboard a Dominion command vessel deep within Skarn-controlled space, Threx stood before the full assembly of Dominion High Command, delivering a report that none of them wanted to hear. "The colony engagement was not a failure of equipment or numbers," he said firmly. "It was a failure of understanding. We approached Earth's people with the same assumptions we apply to every soft world we have previously encountered, and those assumptions were incorrect." A senior commander, broad and heavily scarred from decades of conflict, scoffed openly. "You are suggesting an entire invasion campaign be reconsidered because of 4 individuals." "I am suggesting," Threx said carefully, "that Earth itself is the true variable we have failed to properly calculate. If 4 unarmed liaisons could accomplish what we witnessed at Verath, then a coordinated defense of their home system presents a risk we cannot afford to underestimate." The room fell into heavy debate, voices rising, opinions clashing, until the highest-ranking official present, a towering figure known simply as High Marshal Auric, raised a hand for silence. Then we remove the variable entirely, Oryx said finally, his voice cold and absolute. If Earth is truly the source of this resilience, then Earth becomes the target, not another colony, not another testing ground. We commit the full invasion fleet directly toward their home system, and we end this uncertainty at its source, before it spreads any further among Concord worlds. Threx felt something tighten in his chest that he did not have a word for in his own language, something close to dread, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. "Marshal," he said carefully, "if our intelligence was already this incorrect regarding a single unarmed defense of a colony, I would advise extreme caution before committing our full strength directly against their home world." Oryx's expression did not change. "Your caution has been noted, Commander, and it will be reconsidered once we have finally confirmed what this species truly is, once and for all." The order was given that night, quietly, without ceremony, and across a dozen shipyards throughout Dominion space. The largest invasion fleet the Skarn had assembled in over a century began preparing for a singular destination: Earth. And somewhere among the stars, unaware yet of exactly what was coming, humanity continued about its ordinary lives, entirely unprepared for the fact that it was about to become the center of the galaxy's next great turning point. The warning reached Earth 11 days later, delivered by a Concord courier vessel that broke every protocol regarding advance notice simply to arrive faster. I was there when it landed, standing beside Kalis, on the tarmac of a defense installation just outside a coastal city, watching the sky the way you watch a storm you already know is coming. "A full Dominion fleet," Kalis said, reading the report as it scrolled across her tablet. "Confirmed course, direct approach, projected arrival in 6 days. 6 days," I repeated. Around us, human military command had already begun mobilizing, not with the slow, careful deliberation the Concord practiced, but with the fast, decisive urgency of a species that had spent its entire history preparing for exactly this kind of threat without ever knowing when it might arrive. General Peter Hale, overseeing planetary defense coordination, moved through the command center barking orders with a calm intensity that reminded me why humanity had survived as long as it had, long before anyone from the stars ever noticed us at all. "We do not have Concord-grade weapons," Peter said during the emergency briefing that followed, standing before a room filled with officers from a dozen different nations, who had, for the first time in human history, set aside every old rivalry the moment the sky itself became the shared enemy. "What we have is everything we have ever built, adapted, and improvised, and 6 days to put every bit of it to use. Concord support ships are en route," Kalis added, "but they will not arrive in time for the initial engagement. Earth will need to hold for at least the first several hours alone." "Then we hold," Peter said simply, and no one in that room argued. Over the following days, I watched something unfold that I do not think the Concord could have ever fully prepared for, even with all their careful diplomatic study of our species. Civilian volunteers lined up outside recruitment stations before official announcements even finished airing. Engineers reworked satellite defense systems using decades-old designs never intended for this kind of use. Fishermen, farmers, teachers, people who had never held a weapon in their lives showed up anyway, asking simply where they were needed. Nora spent those 6 days working alongside orbital defense teams, adapting Concord shield technology to interface with human-made systems, merging two completely different approaches to survival into something neither civilization had built before. Lucas worked with a team of engineers repurposing old mining equipment, exactly the kind of improvisation that had saved that research vessel years earlier, scaling it up into planetary defense measures no one had thought possible on this short a timeline. Daniel trained volunteer units in basic tactics, teaching people with no military background how to move, adapt, and survive the way our ancestors always had, long before any of this technology existed. I spent much of that time with Solon, who had insisted on remaining planetside despite the obvious danger, watching humanity prepare with an expression I had never quite seen on him before. "I do not understand this," he admitted one evening. watching a group of teenagers help load supply crates onto a transport vehicle without being asked. None of them are trained soldiers. They do not need to be soldiers, I said. They need to be willing, and willingness is the one thing your intelligence reports could never properly measure. He was quiet for a long moment. I am afraid for you, he said finally. All of you. I appreciate that, I told him honestly. But save some of that fear for them, because in 6 days they are going to learn exactly why fear was never the advantage they thought it was. The Dominion fleet arrived exactly as predicted, breaking into Earth's system in a formation built to overwhelm through sheer scale, dozens of warships arranged with the same methodical confidence that had failed so completely at Vareth. Somewhere among that fleet, Threx stood on the command deck of the lead vessel, watching Earth appear on the display for the first time, blue and quiet, and entirely unaware of exactly how much resistance was waiting for them. High Marshal Oryx's voice echoed across the fleet's communication channels, cold and absolute. Begin full engagement. End this uncertainty permanently. What followed was unlike anything either side had fully prepared for. Human defense fleets, smaller and less advanced than the Dominion's warships, moved with a speed and unpredictability that scattered the invaders' careful formations within the first hour. Orbital platforms, cobbled together from decades-old designs and last-minute improvisation, unleashed defensive fire, calibrated with a precision born from generations of engineering necessity rather than centuries of untested theory. I flew alongside Daniel and Lucas in a small defense craft, weaving through the chaos of the opening engagement, using every trick we had ever learned, every instinct built from a lifetime spent adapting to whatever the world demanded of us. Around us, other human pilots moved the same way, refusing the predictable patterns the Dominion's sensors were built to track, breaking apart formations that had never once failed against any other species they encountered. This is not what our intelligence described, I heard over an intercepted Dominion channel, panic bleeding through the voice despite the careful training beneath it. Threx, watching the battle unfold from his command deck, felt the weight of everything he had warned High Command about finally becoming undeniable reality. Their fleet, built around overwhelming force and careful calculated advance, was being dismantled, not by superior weapons, but by an approach to conflict his people had never encountered on this scale before. Concord relief ships arrived 4 hours into the engagement, faster than originally projected, joining the battle alongside human forces in a combined defense unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed in centuries. Solon, against every instinct his species had ever trained into him, piloted a support vessel directly into the heart of the conflict, providing cover for a stranded human transport crew, an act that would have been unthinkable for his people only weeks earlier. By the 6th hour, the Dominion fleet's formation had fractured into disorganized clusters, their careful strategy unraveling under the combined, adaptive resistance of two civilizations who had learned, in the span of a single desperate day, exactly how much stronger they were fighting together than either could have been alone. High Marshal Oryx's flagship, isolated from the rest of the fractured fleet, found itself surrounded, its shields failing, its weapon systems overwhelmed by a coordinated strike from human and Concord forces working in perfect, hard-earned unison. Aboard that flagship, Threx made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He overrode Oryx's authority, a violation of every rule his culture held sacred, and opened a direct channel to the Human Defense Command. "This is Commander Threx of the Dominion Fleet," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. "I am transmitting a full ceasefire order to remaining Dominion vessels. I ask only that you allow safe passage for those willing to withdraw." On the other end, General Peter Hale considered the request for a long, tense moment before responding. "And Marshal Oryx no longer speaks for this fleet," Threx answered. I arrived at the command station just as that exchange concluded, watching through the display as scattered Dominion vessels began powering down their weapons, one after another, following an order that clearly originated from someone other than the fleet's official leadership. Kalis stood beside me, watching the same display. "It seems your counterpart finally asked the right question," she said quietly. "I do not think he asked it just now," I said. "I think he has been asking it since Kepler. He just finally decided the answer mattered more than his orders." The remaining Dominion forces withdrew over the following hours, their advance fleet effectively broken, their leadership in disarray, and High Marshal Auric, isolated aboard a disabled flagship, was left with no remaining authority to enforce the war he had been so certain would end quickly and decisively in the Dominion's favor. In the days that followed, as Earth began the long process of recovery, Threx requested formal asylum among Concord territory, along with several officers who had grown similarly disillusioned with a war built on assumptions that had failed them completely. His request, remarkably, was granted, following a personal recommendation from Ambassador Kalis herself, who argued that understanding, even from a former adversary, was worth more to the future of galactic peace than any punishment could ever be. I met him once, briefly, during the formal proceedings that followed, in a quiet room away from the noise of celebration and relief that had settled over the Concord Council chambers. "You were the one at Vareth," he said, studying me carefully. "I was," I confirmed. "I spent 2 years trying to understand your people through data alone," he admitted. "I understand now that some things cannot be measured that way." "No," I agreed. "Some things you just have to witness." He nodded slowly, something that almost resembled respect settling into his expression. "For what it is worth, Corporal Voss, I am relieved my final assessment of your species was correct, even if my superiors refused to believe it." "Which assessment was that?" I asked. "That you were never the threat everyone assumed," he said. "You were simply the variable no one else had accounted for." 3 months later, Earth was formally granted full membership within the Concord, not out of pity, and not entirely without a lingering, healthy sense of respectful caution, but out of a genuine, hard-earned understanding of exactly who we were. Colonies that had once feared our unpredictability now requested human liaisons by name. Species who had spent centuries avoiding conflict entirely began quietly studying our history, not to replicate our hardship, but to understand the resilience that had grown from it. I stood on the observation deck of a Concord station months after the battle for Earth had ended, looking out at the stars the same way I had the very first day I arrived among them, except everything about how I understood that view had changed completely. Solon joined me there, quiet for a long moment before speaking. "We used to warn each other about death worlds," he said finally. "Worlds too dangerous, too unpredictable, too resilient to safely approach. And now?" I asked. "Now we simply say one word," he said, almost smiling. "Earth." I looked out at the endless stretch of stars ahead of us, no longer afraid of everything waiting out there in the dark, because for the first time since any of this began, I understood clearly that we were never the ones who needed protecting. They were only ever afraid of us because they had never truly understood us. And now, finally, they did.